Hey guys, welcome to the show. I have a very special guest today, Larry Sanger. He is the co-founder of Wikipedia, and the reason he's on the show today is because he recently came to faith in Christ. And he wrote a blog about it called How a Skeptical Philosopher Became a Christian. So excited that he's a Christian, and I'm excited to have him on the show. Welcome, Larry.
Hey, it's good to be with you.
Thank you for coming on the show. And I want to talk about your journey to faith, which is pretty remarkable. And the title of your blog was How a Skeptical Philosopher Became a Christian. Let's start at the beginning. So you were born into a Lutheran, your parents were Lutheran. And so you were born into a Christian family, in what, I forgot what city it was in.
I was born in the Seattle area, and we moved up to Anchorage, Alaska, um, when I was 7. Yeah, and I grew up there.
And then you were confirmed at the age of 12 in the Lutheran Church, correct?
Right.
And so what happened? And then you say in the blog, you say in your teen years you lost your faith. And then also on top of that, your dad started to look into New Age religion. So tell us about that.
Well, I had always been a very inquisitive kid, and asked a lot of questions, um, and more questions than people had the patience to answer, really. Um, and I I took a philosophy class in my junior year of high school, and it was just fascinating to me. And the following summer, I basically started what became a lifelong profession and hobby, really something that's very close to my heart, which is philosophy in general. I never, although I'm not a professor any longer, I continue to care a lot about philosophical questions. And so when I was a teenager, I knew a lot of people in my life who had, I thought, sort of ruined their lives, or they made mistakes that made them miserable in various ways. Like my parents had gotten a divorce. I knew kids in high school who were like strung out on drugs, maybe teenage pregnancy. One murderer is, um, not that far away from me, and all of these people, it seemed to me, had the problems that they had due to a failure to, well, believe the things that they should. Like that the guys who were strung out on drugs sincerely believed that, drugs were mind expanding. They said so. I said, well, you're just wrong. And look at what it's done to you. So I said, well, now wait a minute. Maybe I also have some really debilitating, dangerous errors. So I thought it was very important that I set my knowledge on a firm foundation, to use philosophical language, and uh, I basically underwent a process of doubt, very similar to that of Descartes.
Mhm.
Um, so Cartesian doubt is what the philosophers call it. It's like raising all of your beliefs to the ground and trying to rebuild from more certain foundations. So that's essentially what I tried to do. And then, of course, one of the beliefs that went by the wayside, or was confirmed, that I couldn't take too seriously, was a belief in God. But even before that, I basically found that I had stopped praying to God, and basically the belief in God had slipped away. And I failed to confirm it again when I started thinking about it again when I was about 17 years old.
And when you were 17, you called a pastor to ask some questions. And what was the response from this pastor?
Yeah. He said essentially that, well, I don't know what he said exactly. All I can tell you is the impression that I brought back from it. And that is that he was being rather dismissive. I think he might have said a few sort of perfunctory things, um, but nothing that stuck in memory, nothing that I could follow up on. And that was disillusioning to me,
Hmm.
basically. Yeah, I mean, it confirmed me to a certain extent in my unbelief. It's like, here's this guy who is supposed to be pastoral, supposed to like help guide people like me, and he seems to be threatened by my questions. Well, maybe my sorts of questions are just like beyond him. And if he's a typical pastor, then doesn't that mean that I should, you know, I'm pretty safe in rejecting my former belief? So
Right.
that's how I thought about it.
Yeah. So you said because of that experience and you thought that you inferred from that only dogmatic people believe in God, therefore such a belief must be irrational.
Right? Exactly.
And then you converted to methodological skepticism. Can you tell us what that is?
Well, I sort of alluded to it before. Ordinary skepticism is just the belief that we cannot have knowledge of some kind. Like external world skepticism says we can't know things about the world outside of our own minds, really. But this is different. This is a method or a process that you use to arrive at truth. The idea is you do deliberately don't make up your mind until all the facts in, all the facts are in, and even more, unless the evidence that you have for a particular belief rises to a level of adequate proof. And for me, it was a very high level, then you simply don't make up your mind at all. So for a very long time, I basically said it's impossible to have knowledge about anything that is very complex, because as soon as there is much that is complex in the picture, the reasons that you could have for believing in something are never going to be adequate.
Right. And then and so in 1986, you went off to college, which is the same year I went off to college. We're
Uh-huh.
the same age. Um, and you went to Reed College, and I love you wrote that the unofficial motto was communism, atheism, free love. Um, and so at that time, you were kind of intending on becoming a college professor. And in college, how did you? Well, first of all, you began looking into Ayn Rand's objectivism. So, tell us what by the way, if people don't know, Ayn Rand wrote The Fountainhead, Atlas Shrugged, etc. Tell us what objectivism is and why you were drawn to Ayn Rand's writings.
Well, mostly because she was the only name out there um, that I knew of that was very firmly committed to reason or at least she said she was, um, as a method of truth seeking, essentially. And that made a big difference to me, I suppose. I also agreed with her on like her political philosophy, which is capitalism. Um, I was
Mhm.
inclined in the direction of ethical egoism. Not to say that, and what that means is basically right and wrong can be understood in terms of your own rational self-interest. So if you ought to do something, if it is right for you to do it, then you must be able to explain that in terms of what is good for you in the long run, according to your enlightened self-interest. And that enlightenment is supposed to do the work of, the requirements of justice. Um, uh, but I struggled with that bit. Um, but I after a decade or so, my interest in Ayn Rand just sort of declined. The more philosophy I read, um, and I would say my hero, my philosophical hero, was became uh, Thomas Reid, um, who wrote. Well, he's the founder of the Scottish School of Common Sense. So, um, and anyway, I don't need to go into the details. So it was sort of a passing phase, but the ethical egoism did stick with me for a while.
Yeah, it's fun, interesting because in the 90s I was a devoted Ayn Randian, if that's the way you can put it. But I was in the same I was in that kind of same um kind of I revered her and I thought her philosophy, I thought Howard Rourke was such an amazing character.
Yeah,
And he had integrity and he had this kind of unshakable I don't know, this unshakable kind of vision of life. And I just really loved her philosophy.
yeah.
But then of course things I kind of grew out of that as well and things changed. But in college, you met or you had an interaction with a Christian, this guy Phil Reese. And what tell us about that because it made a lasting impression on you. Tell us about that interaction.
Um, well, we got to be friends, and we talked about a lot of different things. I guess I remember talking to him about like cosmology and what if there is a creator, what the creator must be like. Um, and it was all interesting. And I think he probably thought that I was, not far from the kingdom. Um, but he was wrong at the time. Um, but I really enjoyed talking to him. Um, but uh, one day he uh, caught me in a sin, essentially. Uh, a typical sort of sin for a college student to do, but I won't say what it is. Um, not proud of it, of course. At the time, though, I didn't think it was really a sin. I didn't really think it was wrong
Right.
exactly. Um, and but after that, basically, we stopped talking. I guess he sort of like washed his hands of me. So that was a little disappointing, but it was just a data point, though. At that point, it stuck with me, but it was a data point.
So did that kind of turn you even more off to Christianity?
No, no, I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say that.
And
Uh,
then, yeah. And then in grad school in 1992, you tell us about this kind of quote, no concept view of God. You decided to have a no concept view of God.
yeah. Well, uh, without going into too much detail, right? The idea is that our notion of God is uh, a soul. And at the time, I thought the only thing similar to a soul that I have experience of that I could admit exists is my mind. And that soul created the universe with a thought. Um, and well, I don't have any experience. No one has any experience of a thought simply creating something. Of course, this is before, brain prosthetics. But nevertheless, there was no experience of such a thing. Um, of course, we have experience of building things with our hands, guided by our minds, but direct creation with our minds, no concept at all. But that's supposed to be essential to the idea of God. And therefore, we have no concept of God. That's what I said. No, I don't actually. I think the premises are all true, but the conclusion just doesn't follow. That's what I think now, and I later, as I suppose we'll get to, came to reject this argument.
Right. And then one of the things that happened in, I guess this was in grad school. I think were you a TA? And then one of your students presented the fine tuning argument, and that had an impression on you.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I had heard the argument before, but it was uh, he put it in a fresh and persuasive way, and I had no way to answer him at the time. And I found, tears in my eyes, but I know it wasn't simply because I was like humiliated at not being able to answer him or something like that. There was something deeper than that, I believe. I think I was like remembering what it was like to be a believer,
Hmm.
you know, and I think I was feeling a kind of loss that I hadn't felt in a long, long time by that point, right? And like over 10 years, which is a long time when you're, college student. So yeah, and he just left, tactfully, I suppose. Just sort of leaving me to my thoughts.
And during this whole time, you were not interested at all in the new atheists like Dawkins and Dennett and Harris. You weren't. Why weren't you interested in those guys?
Yeah, that was a little before those guys started doing what they came to call new atheism. But yeah, later on, after I got my PhD and they started getting really popular, writing their most famous books, um, I was not impressed by them, mostly because they weren't philosophers and they weren't making serious philosophical arguments. It's like I could explain this stuff better than these guys are. That's what I thought at the time. Um, and I was disappointed with both sides of the debate. I thought that, well, the theists are being their usual selves, being glib and drawing conclusions too easily and failing to address obvious objections, things like that. But on the other side, the atheists weren't actually catching them in the most important objections, that they could make. They were just resorting to mockery, which is not right, neither persuasive nor polite. So,
Christopher Hitchens was especially good at the mockery part.
yes.
Um, and then, of course, in 2001, you co-founded Wikipedia, which was, it's a pretty big deal. What was that like?
Well, not right away, actually. It took it took a first draft of an encyclopedia system, which we called Newpedia, to decide that we needed to make the whole process a lot easier for the general public to participate in. And so when a friend of mine told me about wikis, I said, this would probably be a good way to add to our encyclopedic uh, holdings. And so Wikipedia, in short, was born. It just took off very quickly after that. Um, but after like 14 months after we started Wikipedia, the if you remember, the dot-com boom of the late 90s had turned to bust, and the parent company of Wikipedia, called bombas.com, um, they were losing money badly. I think they had lost a deal with Google, or I forget which, a big ad deal. So they couldn't pay for the new hires. That included me. So I was the last of the new hires to be laid off after 14 months. But by that time, Wikipedia had taken on a life of its own, basically. So
And
I
yeah,
wasn't really so much.
and explain because I think a lot of people don't know what wikis are. Why is it called Wikipedia?
Well, a wiki, the concept has been out there since at least 1995, when the first wiki was made, the Portland Pattern Repository by Ward Cunningham. And Basically, a wiki is simply a collection of pages that operates like a bulletin board where, anybody can pull up a page and write it and rewrite it, but the page history is preserved. So if somebody like does some vandalism, it's very easy to revert. And it just turns out, and this was known at the time when Wikipedia got started, that it's very resilient. The idea is that the most active contributors far outnumber the bad contributors, and so it tends to go in the direction that the active contributors want it to go in. So I basically repurposed the technology for encyclopedias.
Nice. Okay. So, and then you had another big turning point in your life that you say changed your understanding of ethics. One was your marriage and then your first child. So, and then I think that you say in your blog that that's when Ayn Rand's self-interest philosophy kind of went out the window. So, talk about those two events.
Sure. Um, well, when I got married, I just noted with some interest that I would die for her. And when I had a child, even more, now I had two people that I was willing to die for. Um, and from an objectivist point of view, that is to say, the point of view of a follower of Ayn Rand, that's an interesting thing to say, isn't it? Because
Hmm.
it seems like I'm placing their interest ahead of mine. Now you might say, well, no, that's still like explained by your rational self-interest. And my response to that is, how is that in my self-interest at all? I'm dead, so I don't have any interests any longer. I'm, I'm deliberately putting their interests ahead of mine when I die for them, if I ever have to. So yeah, so that meant that here are a couple of people whose interests I am willing to put ahead of mine, and that explains why I would be willing to die for them. And therefore, gee, I guess that means ethical egoism is wrong. And in fact, I uh, do uh, I do explain right and wrong in terms of other people's interests and what is good for them. Of course, I mean, that's how I think now. That's just obvious to me now, but it's obvious to most people. But for the followers of Rand, it isn't.
Right. And then when you were raising your kids, you expose them to the Bible. Why did you do that? Because you at this point you weren't a believer yet, but you read the Bible to them or that you exposed them to the Bible.
Yeah, well, my education at Reed and later was in the liberal arts, and like consistently through, and I went through the entire um, humanities curriculum at Reed, and which I really liked and discovered as extremely important. So I decided to when I decided to homeschool my boys, I decided to basically lead them through the great classics of Western civilization. And what greater classic is there from anybody's point of view than the Bible? So of course they had to read at least some of the Bible.
And so what was that was when you were doing that with your kids, were you sort of absorbing the Bible as well, or were you just kind of was it just kind of a
Not, I mean, I was reading parts like Genesis and the first part of Exodus and maybe a few other things, like one of the Gospels. Um, and I think we did Romans once. These are all things that I read enough when I was a child and heard enough, you know, sermons on them that it was perfectly familiar. And when I was reading them at the time, it's like it made no great impression on me. It was I wasn't really trying that hard to understand it on its own terms in a way that a Christian would understand it. And, the lesson here is that there is a big difference between, reading a text as its recipients um, read it, and just reading it to, I don't know, acquaint yourself with things, and making no effort in that direction at all, and which is
Right,
what I
just
was.
kind of like reading it as literature, basically, rather than the word of God kind of thing.
Right, I suppose. I mean, I think that it's entirely possible for a completely atheistic person to just be a diligent student, sit down, try to read the Bible cover to cover, and understand it as a Christian does. But of course, they never do that. If they're going to take it up and spend that much time on it, they're going to be reading a lot of critical commentary by scholars who are following the historical critical method, um, and which essentially by its very method denies the credibility of miracles and so forth, which are so. Uh, yeah, if you want to understand the Bible as it is in itself, you're going to be doing something different than simply running your eyes over the words and like letting those activate the ideas that they do to your modern mind. But that's not what reading the Bible really ought to amount to.
Right. And then in 2011, you came across an article by the atheist Peter Boghossian, who's very popular now. But what was your reaction to that article?
Well, yeah, basically, he was defending the indefensible view, and I don't think he believes it any longer. I can't imagine that he does, based on things that he has said later. But at the time, what he was arguing is that it's actually appropriate for a philosophy professor to like pin down Christians in his classroom and try to disabuse them of their faith.
Hmm.
Um, and I was saying, look, I'm a non-believer like you, dude, but that's not how to teach philosophy. The way you do it is you present ideas on both sides and let them make up their own minds. You try to present the best arguments on both sides. It's like, isn't that obvious? Doesn't everybody think that? Well, apparently he didn't. He struck me as a wokester at the time, before they were called woke, I suppose. So I found it ironic when later he ended up being, well, opposed to such heavy-handed, you know, authoritarian tactics.
Yeah, he ended up writing the fake journal review or the fake journal. I forgot who he wrote that with, but
Uh, yes, I know what you're talking about. I forget what it's called.
it was like a super woke, journal thing, and it got accepted into a prestigious journal.
Right,
Uh, it was all a kind of a gag, and it was basically anti-woke. And so it's interesting that he uh, he kind of came to that conclusion later in life.
right.
Um, and then in 2014, 2015,
Mhm.
you wrote a couple of essays bemoaning the worsening of the culture of the West, which you associated with the decline of religion. So at this point in 2014, 15, I mean,
Mhm.
you understood, obviously, you understood at least the value of a Judeo-Christian worldview and how it helps sustain and it helps sustain a civilization, a society.
For sure. Yeah, I did. I mean, at the time, I was really not much closer to being a Christian, but I could see increasingly, and I wasn't the only one to say such things, um, that the basically, as we throw Christianity out of the window, we're not really replacing it with anything. And in the vacuum, there is a great moral loss. And people, I put it down to essentially the lack of taking moral responsibility for our actions. Um,
Well, Nietzsche warned about this, obviously, in the gay science, right?
did he? I never read that one. Yeah.
Well, the madman, like the madman and the gay science goes around the town and says, we've killed God, God is dead, and what's going to happen now? I mean, what are we going to do? Because
Right.
there's this giant vacuum, and what's going to happen to us now? So
Right.
yeah,
Right. I guess he has the same trope in Thus Spake Zarathustra.
yes,
So
yes. And then in 2017, you wrote a blog post and explain what this means. It's, it was called "Could God Have Evolved?"
right. So um, just think of what modern technology would look like to somebody from 1,000 years ago. It would look like magic. Even to 100 years ago, of course, then people had already started thinking about science fiction, so it wouldn't seem like magic. But nevertheless, like the whole idea of being able to talk to an AI, for example, or actually walking, talking robots that are actually created by human beings, this would like shake the faith or something, I imagine, of somebody from the Middle Ages. Well, imagine then that the singularity happens. And there isn't just like another 100 years of development. Imagine there's 1 billion years of development after that. Um, then, all the levers that can be found could be found by this super high speed intelligence. Um, and uh, and perhaps, the technology to harness whole planets and suns and eventually, galaxies and universes might evolve. I'm not saying this is actually scientifically possible. It probably isn't. But I'm just saying we can imagine it. In fact, there are science fiction writers who did imagine it. Larry Niven in the Ringworld books.
Hmm.
Um, and it's very interesting. Sort of that actually shifted my perspective, that book itself, a little bit on this. Uh, because then, well, if that's conceivable, I'm not saying it's likely, but I'm saying if you can conceive of that and you can sort of understand that, like there's this something that might, for all intents and purposes, seem to be a brain, but the technology is so advanced that sort of it exists in a kind of ether or something spiritual-ish. And sure, it could have a thought, and then things would come into existence. Um, that's kind of like what we're talking about when we're talking about the creation of the universe with a thought. And then all you have to add is, well, just imagine that such a being was just always there. There you
Yeah,
have, that's God. Now, that's actually not the concept of God according to natural theology, whatever. But the point is that it sort of gave me pause. It said, wait a minute. So um, that seems like, and I didn't think that this had happened. I was not at all arguing for a simulation, not at all. I was just saying, this seems to make it more conceivable that God exists. So that seemed to refute my earlier argument, my no concept argument. So here's a way in which a thought could result in the creation of something um, with the sufficiently advanced technology.
yes. And then in 2019, you wrote two more essays. One was called "Why Be Moral," and then another called "A Theory of Evil." And you were very affected by the whole Jeffrey Epstein scandal. Uh, and so talk about that and what that led, because that led to you reading books on the occult.
Well, starting books on the occult. Basically, to make a long story short, I had a friend, have a friend, who uh, basically introduced me to the whole notion of uh, elite pedophile rings. like that of Epstein and pedowood, the prevalence of pedophilia in Hollywood, um, the Catholic Church scandals, um, and many, many, many more. And you'd be shocked if you actually list them all. And these are not conspiracy theories. This is stuff that's in the news, has been in the news over the past like 30, 40 years. So much more than you can think of, um, or that you want to think of. And yet, a lot of the people who are accused of this, because so many of them were never brought to justice if they really were guilty, um, are interested in the occult, which is also something that you can confirm for yourself. Um, and what my friend said was that he knew some of these people personally. He had done work for them, and he knew for a fact that they thought of what they're doing as, like sex rights that have some sort of magical properties or something. Like that stuff, that sort of sex magic um, uh, of the ancient mystery cults never went away.
Hmm.
And that some of the most powerful people in the world are engaged in it. That's what he said. I never really quite, I mean, I want to see proof. I'm still constitutionally a skeptic, so I'm not like on board with this, and I'm not going to make any accusations or anything like that, because I don't know. But the interesting thing is, he was trying to persuade me of this by pointing me to books on the occult,
Mm.
and I started reading a few of them and said, I am not, this is like really creeping me out. And a large part of the reason for that is that according to the people themselves, the gnosis, in other words, the secret knowledge,
You're right.
was supposed to have a spiritual powers.
Hmm.
Well, I don't want to open any spiritual doors that should remain shut. And if there are any spiritual powers out there, then that must mean that God exists, and I want to be on his side, that's for sure. Now, that was not an argument. That was not a come to Jesus moment. It was just a statement that, like, okay, if there is anything to this, then, I would want to be a Christian and be on the side of God. I know that for sure. Um, but so I put off reading the Bible. I thought that would be the way to sort of get a proper background without exposing myself to all of that garbage. Um, because so much of occultism is a direct uh, response to really a perversion of
Hmm.
a biblical symbology and doctrine and so forth. Um, it's very insidious. It's very nasty. And well, then I should learn the Bible, because that at least would show me what they're reacting to. That's what I thought. Um, so I resolved to eventually read it, but it wasn't like right away. It wasn't a huge high priority. But finally, I did start reading it in the following winter.
Yeah, and you were also kind of, as you say, talking to God. You were sort of you were praying, basically. But so what was that like when you were kind of praying to God during that time?
I don't know. I don't really think I did that very much. Let's put it this way. When I was a young child, I actually did sort of imagine talking to God. I wasn't sure that God was actually responding, but I was imagining a conversation, as I think I'm not the only person who does this. And then throughout my unbelieving years, I continued to sort of have philosophical dialogues with a supremely wise being, because that is a useful sort of, you know, uh, tool, intellectual tool to come to conclusions about things. Um, but when I started reading the Bible, I started doing that again, just because it was sort of like it felt natural, I suppose. Maybe I was led by the Holy Spirit. Not really sure exactly why I started doing it. I didn't think that I was praying to begin with. I just thought, you know, if I'm going to really understand the Bible on its own terms, then, it would help to sort of have a dialogue with God. If I can't actually have one, then I can sort of make one up and based on what I was reading.
Right. And then you had kind of you started reading Stephen Meyer, who's been on the show I think a couple of times. So how did Stephen Meyer's arguments, the cosmological and the fine-tuning argument, how did that affect you?
I was, to be clear, I was looking at a lot of videos at the time and a lot of secondary sources of various sorts. Um, but indeed, it was one video. Like I didn't uh, read any of his books or anything, but there was one video that I watched that was very interesting, that seemed to provide a, a new perspective on the design argument that I didn't have before, or actually the cosmological argument. Now that I think about it, um, so which is basically uh, on my formulation, the an argument from causality. So there needs to be a cause of many different aspects of the universe. Um, they You cannot explain the fundamental laws of the universe um, in terms of something more fundamental. They are fundamental laws, after all, whatever you start out with. And yet they seem to be, well, there's two interesting facts about them. One is that they seem to be contingent, which is to say, maybe they could have been otherwise. And that's especially true of the scientific constants. There, we're talking about numbers, and the numbers could be from any of a large range. Then the other thing is that if you look at the different levels of, and by the way, I'm getting beyond Meyer, because I don't know if Meyer said these things. I don't think he did. Um, uh, the idea is that if you want to explain the laws of chemistry, you can in terms of the laws of physics. And if you want to explain the laws of like biochemistry and biology, you can do that in terms of chemistry and so forth. Um, but the interesting thing is, like, even if you have this perfect explanation of the order of the periodic table, for example, it's just like amazing how it's all structured like it was designed. Um, you know, but it all flows out of a few rules, right? And a decent chemistry student can tell you why it has the structure that it does. And
Mhm.
every chemistry teacher knows that backwards and forwards. So it's not a mystery. But the interesting thing is that all of those laws and the constants required for that order to emerge coincided. All right, that seems like an important thing to explain because it's a
Mhm.
significant fact about the universe, right? And it seems like the only sort of explanation that one could offer for that about that is that well, it had that conjunction of laws would have this structure as a result, right?
Right.
So, and yet that sort of phenomenon, which the emergent emergent phenomena is what it's called. So these properties of the universe that emerge out of lower level properties. Um, it appears at every level of nature, from physics to chemistry to biology, geology to anthropology, psychology, all the rest of that. Is to the extent that it's like law driven. The amazing thing is that that at each level, the emergent properties seem to be predicted by the laws and the constants that underlie them. Not just reducible to those more fundamental laws, but why were the fundamental laws as they were?
Hmm.
You really want to, if you could explain that, then you would be explaining all of the order in the universe. And the only way to explain that, it seems to me, is to actually make sense of and make use of the observation that the universe is ordered.
Hmm.
So, and that seems to require anticipation of the results. This is why scientists, when they talk about this topic, sometimes uh, fall back on the idea of backwards causation.
Mm.
Um, and um, yeah, well, I think that a better model, the only one that we really can make sense of, is that there is some sort of mind-like entity that can anticipate what the effects are of a certain rule set and then legislates that rule set, essentially. So that's a
Yes.
version of the design argument. It's sort of like continuous with the argument from causality and contingency. So
And then you decided to, I think in 2020, February of 2020, you decided to start reading the Gospels. Um, and so what happened? What, is that when you had your conversion while you were reading the Gospels?
well, I'd started reading the Bible from Genesis and read all of the Old Testament. I got to the Gospels sometime in February. Um, and I don't know, I did not have a single come to Jesus experience. It was very gradual. And I know some people have difficulty with the notion, but it's possible. It's happened. I'm not the first person that it happened to either. Um, the idea is uh, I had been, talking to God or imagining that I was talking to God, and I finally decided, well, I've got to admit it to myself that I guess I believe that God exists. So I'm just going to say, I'm going to actually finally make a prayer, and I made just sort of um, just lying in bed with my eyes closed, something like the sinner's prayer,
Hmm.
um, one evening in that period when I was reading the Bible very intensely. So it took me many months after that before I would be willing to say that I was like a full-fledged Christian, that I had adopted, the basics of Orthodox Christian belief. Um, the But I would say that at that time I was still believing in, putting my trust in the God that I still believe in now.
Mm. And then you started to read the Bible with family, friends. So you kind of were in this Bible study, right?
Yeah, right, right. With my mom and dad, who had not interacted in years, it was quite a thing to actually be reading the Bible for the first time all the way through with both of them and my sister, who was, very devout. And so that was really something. That was my second time through, which I guess I would have started in March. I guess it was March of
And
2020.
and your dad has come back to the faith, right? He left New Age stuff and came back to the faith.
Yeah, that was just a phase, I suppose. Yeah.
And are they back together or no? They're
No.
um and so what what has been the response? I mean, after you posted this blog, what has been, I mean, there's been a lot of people contacting you, but what has been the response from your friends, people, in your life?
They haven't taken notice of it. My non-believing friends, now I haven't told them about it. Maybe I should. I probably should. Like my old grad student buddies. Um, I've kind of lost touch with with them, but they're still good friends. I should do it. But they haven't, they probably don't know still, because I don't think they're they're like Christian
Right.
themselves, so they wouldn't have got wind of the news. It's not news outside of the Christian world, as far as I
Well, it's good news. So what now let's end on this. What would you, because you've been through this, you've struggled with, kind of all these thoughts and questions your whole life, basically. What advice would you give to someone who's watching who may be a skeptic or who may be just even completely opposed to God? What advice would you give them?
well, I mean, first of all, I guess I should point out that I've been a Christian for 5 years now. So I'm talking about I'm revealing the conversion that happened in the past, because now I feel like I'm able to give the answer to a question like you just asked just now, which I might not have been able to do so well in 2020. Um, but it really depends on the person. I think I would just like point a few things out that are reasonably easy to confirm for oneself. And one is that there are a lot of brilliant people, like on anybody's point of view, brilliant people who are Christians,
Hmm.
right? So don't think otherwise, because that's true.
Yes.
And second of all, um, the Bible, according to me and according to a lot of other people, has much, much more wisdom and sense than you know about. And it's hard to see this. I know you've probably, you know, uh, read parts of it. Maybe in a past life you read the whole thing, and but now you just find it all to be nonsense. Well, I suspect that you never really did understand it very well. I certainly didn't, and I had a fairly religious upbringing, at least until the age of 13 or so. And there are a lot of people in that position, especially from my generation and a little younger. They had a religious upbringing, and then they just fell away in their teen years or maybe in college or
Mhm.
whatever. And such people often are just never exposed to the true beauties and wisdom of the Bible. And you just trust me on this, as somebody who was a non-believer for over 35 years, you don't understand it the way that Christians understand it. And I don't just mean that that Christians like have bought into it and therefore it's more persuasive to them. No, I mean that from anybody's point of view, they understand things that you don't understand. And if you really want to understand Christianity, the religion, and Christian doctrine, you have to come to grips with certain things that you don't now understand. So a large part of the reason why I was a non-believer for such a long time is I didn't understand the Bible. All right, I didn't think there was anything there to understand. I was wrong. I was very wrong. So I think that's also pretty
Yeah.
important.
And it reminds me of, the allegory of Plato's cave. It's like these, these prisoners in the cave, since they were children, they're chained. They can only see this wall in front of them. There's a wall behind them, and behind the wall, there's the puppeteers, you know, with different objects. And then there's a fire behind that. So all they're seeing their entire lives, all they're seeing are shadows on the wall. So they believe that to be reality.
Right.
And then finally one of the prisoners escapes, gets out of the cave and goes into the real world, into the sunshine. And he's like, "Wait, this is reality. This is true." And then he goes back and he tries to tell the prisoners they try to kill him because they don't want to hear it.
Right,
So that's kind of like, that's what it's like to me is it's a skeptic. It's like you still believe the shadows on the wall are reality, but it's not.
right, right. I mean,
So,
if you really really want to refute Christianity, try doing this. Try reading the Bible and understanding it the way that its uh, believers really understand it, and talk to them about that stuff. All right, and try to refute that stuff. Good luck with that, especially if you're talking to people who know their stuff.
mm,
This then you're doing theology, and theologians um, are, they give their lives to understanding the coherence of the Bible and biblical doctrine. So,
right. And I found when I became a Christian 15 years ago, I found that, out of all, not that I had read every philosophical book, but when I read the Bible, it was like the first time in my life, I was like, finally a coherent uh understanding of reality. Like I finally get it. This is reality.
right.
So,
Mhm.
so
Right.
yeah, we're gonna leave it. Thank you, Larry, for coming on the show, and all the best to you in the good fight of the faith. And
Yep.
yeah, thank you so much.
Well, thanks for having me on. It's been a, a good interview. I appreciate it.
All right. Well, thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you next time.